the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians together could not defeat the Russians. And along comes Trump, and Trump wants to take the Americans out of the equation as much as possible. He doesn't want to spend more money on Ukraine, and he's willing to send weapons, but only if the Europeans buy those weapons and ship them to Ukraine. So the Americans are basically being excised from the equation. How do the Europeans make up for that? And the answer is they can't. They are all those European countries are in worse economic shape today than they were in 2022 when this war started. The German economy, the French economy, and the British economy are all in serious trouble. The French and British economies have serious debt problems. They can't raise the money themselves to make up for the lack of American economic support for Ukraine. This is why these countries are talking about stealing Russian assets, which is, opening Pandora's box.
Yeah.
They want to steal these Russian assets because they have no money of their own to give to Ukraine. This just shows you how desperate the situation is. But again, you have people like Macron who talk in ways that make you think they're delusional.
Okay, well, if we needed one more evidence, and we will pull one more into it, and Bundeskanzler Merz also was brought on to give a voice for the prosecutions, as it were, here, and he also does not lack a lot of the things that Trump says.
Some of it is understandable, some of it is unacceptable to us from a European perspective. I don't see any need for the Americans to want to save democracy in Europe now, because if it could be saved, we would manage it on our own. In my discussions with the Americans, I say America first is fine, but America alone cannot be in your interest. You also need partners in the world. And one of those partners could be Europe. And if you can't do anything with Europe, then at least make Germany your partner.
I don't know. That's a little funny there that you're lecturing the U.S. that you can't go it alone, but you got to go with some of Europe, or I don't know, maybe Germany or so. But at the same time, he's telling Trump that we're not going to do what you're going to want to do. So again, though, I have to ask whether it's Merz, Macron, or Starmer, what is your plan if you reject Trump? Then what are you going to do? How are you going to continue to prosecute this war into 26?
I don't know how they're going to do that. I mean, what's going on here is, he's talking about a partnership, but the Americans, and here we're talking mainly about the Trump administration and really about President Trump himself, but President Trump and his European counterparts are basically at war with each other. I mean, this is not a military war, but right. It's a war of words.
Big time.
Trump, let's face it, Trump's contempt for the Europeans in general and for the European leaders knows no bounds. He says things about the European elites that none of his predecessors would ever have said. It's really quite remarkable. He loathes them. And of course, they loathe him as well. And you can't blame them. If you're a European leader and you listen to Trump talk, you're going to get very angry. And you're going to want to say bad things about him in the way that he says bad things about you. So you have sort of an escalating rhetoric here between the two sides that shows no signs of ending. And by the way, Danny, just to take this one step further, at some point, as you and I both know, the war in Ukraine is going to be lost. And it's going to be a devastating defeat for NATO. That's going to happen at some point. And then the blame game is going to set in, right? Who is responsible for this disaster? And the Europeans, of course, will want to blame Trump for bailing out at the last moment. They'll make the argument that we had the Russians on the ropes. They were not doing well on the battlefield. Their economy was collapsing. And Donald Trump pulled out. He bailed out on us. And that's why we lost. Trump, of course, is going to great lengths not to completely bail out because he wants to be in a position to say, first of all, this was Joe Biden's war, not my war. And secondly, it's only appropriate that the Europeans played the principal role. But I want you to understand that I supported the Europeans and I was willing to give them any weaponry that they wanted. And then he has all sorts of other stories to tell, like the whole subject of secondary sanctions. You remember secondary sanctions, where we're going to sanction the Russians by putting sanctions on India and China? Well, what Trump cleverly did was he said, I will put secondary sanctions on India and China if the Europeans put secondary sanctions on India and China. And of course, the Europeans have no intention whatsoever of doing that. So nobody can blame Trump for not putting secondary sanctions on Russia, because the Europeans wouldn't do it. So he protected himself in a very important way. So what I'm saying to you, Danny, is the blame game is setting in now, right? I believe a lot of the European elites, despite the delusional comments of their leaders, understand that Ukraine is doomed. And I think those people now want to make sure that they don't get blamed for this catastrophe.
Yeah, good luck with that. But you know, there's also, in addition to the European elite, there's also what you can maybe refer to as generally the Western elite, because a lot of those are also in the United States and seem to be right in line with what the Europeans are. One of whom, kind of headlined by General Jack Keane, who seems to be all about the European side of this.
For Zelensky to sign a deal, he has to have some pretty specific security guarantees in place to sign anything, to make certain that Russia doesn't reattack. We know what Putin's objectives are here, and that's to topple the government in Ukraine and take control of the country and expand into Eastern Europe. He has not given up on those objectives. He would look at any deal that he makes as temporary in his mind, and looking for the opportunity, likely when President Trump leaves office, to be able to re-engage. That means that the security guarantees and how Ukraine gets protected on the ground and in the air and at sea, obviously with military capability, is absolutely paramount.
I still cannot come to any grips, especially this late in the game, to why anyone is saying, hey, you know what would be cool? Let's get security guarantees and put American potential, and he said this last week in very detailed, American air power and American ground forces on the ground inside of Ukraine, on the Ukraine side of the law, so that after this mythical peace that I don't see any possibility is going to be agreed to, but let's just say it did, that on the other side, we would actually spill American blood to defend western part of Ukraine. What the hell?
Well, I mean, we're not going to give a meaningful security guarantee to Ukraine. Donald Trump is certainly not going to give a meaningful security guarantee to Ukraine. We can talk about that till we're blue.
So do you think that he says to him and others like him, of course, he's just a representative. Do you think they say stuff like this? They know it's not going to happen. Is this maybe a sophisticated part of the setting up for the blame game that, well, all you had to do was this, but you wouldn't do it, so it's your fault? I mean, do you think that's part of it?
Well, I think if you're in the mainstream media and you appear on television like General Keane does, you have to make those arguments. There's just a narrative that you have to follow. Otherwise, you would lose your job. It's like
well, we can't have that.
It's like dealing with the Middle East and the Israel-Palestine conflict. If anybody in the mainstream started talking about the Gaza genocide and used the word genocide and said Israel was committing a genocide, said that in a serious way, that person would lose his or her job very quickly. You're just not allowed to say that. This is how it works in America. The idea that, we can have an open discourse about Ukraine or an open discourse about what's going on with regard to Israel and its various wars is a myth. It's just not possible. People like you and I are excluded from the mainstream, and the mainstream discourse is dominated by people like General Keane. And General Keane intuitively knows that he has to make certain arguments, otherwise he would lose his job. It's just the way the world works.
Yeah, well, we certainly can't have anybody putting their job at risk by telling the truth. Yeah, I know. It's the way it is. It's the way it's been probably forever, but it seems to be getting worse as we go along today.
I don't think it's been like this forever. It was not like this during the Cold War.
All right, fair point.
During the Cold War, and even in the early stages of the unipolar moment, you could make controversial arguments and still get on, public television or NBC or even Fox News. But we've reached the point now where there are just serious limits on what you can say about Israel and the Middle East, and what you can say about Ukraine. And you hardly hear anyone in the mainstream media make the arguments that you and I make. And what befuddles you and befuddles me is that the arguments that we're making, people could disagree with them, but there is a lot of evidence and a lot of powerful logic that underpins what we're saying.
Right.
These are not crazy arguments. These are arguments that should at least be heard, should at least be taken seriously, but they're not. We're consigned to the sidelines. We're just not allowed to make these arguments. And of course, General Keane is making a completely different set of arguments, and the arguments that he makes are politically acceptable. They're not politically incorrect. If he were to make politically incorrect arguments about the war in Ukraine, and certainly about Israel, he'd lose his job.
Yeah, and I'll just tell you, just kind of an aside, that's one of the things that I find particularly irksome. Okay, you want to make the claim, like you say, that the people are just, the Keanes have to say this, or he's going to lose his job, or that Macron has to say what he said a second ago, or he's going to get voted out of office or something. But if they're going to make those statements, then I think it should at least be incumbent to say, all right, to your point a second ago, at least provide the logic trail. How do you think that there could be security guarantees? How would that work without getting us drawn into a nuclear war? How do you see Emmanuel Macron to have something to where the Ukraine side cannot give away any territory and still have a just and lasting peace? How can that physically be manifest? But there is no such. They just make these statements like I have cards without ever having to define what those cards are.
Yeah, I agree. I often say to myself when I listen to a lot of these elites speak, and this includes, people in the media who have big time reputations. I say to myself, these people didn't take strategy 101. If you took strategy 101, you just wouldn't be saying the things that you're saying. It's like the whole NATO expansion business. There are all sorts of people who argue that the Russians should not have been concerned by NATO expansion. It was not a serious threat to them. And you just sort of say to yourself, how could anybody possibly say that, right? If you're Russia, and you remember that during the Cold War, NATO was a mortal threat to the Soviet Union, your predecessor, and it is a powerful military alliance, and it brings a lot of dangerous equipment along with it. Of course, the Russians are going to feel threatened by NATO expansion. Of course, they're going to feel threatened when NATO talks about bringing Ukraine into its fold. I mean, common sense tells you that. But there are all sorts of people who just reject that logic. The idea that NATO expansion is a threat is dismissed out of hand. You could argue, and this is what the Clinton administration did in the 90s, that there's no doubt the Russians think that NATO expansion is a threat, and we understand that. But we, the Clinton administration, think we can finesse it. They thought that they could convince Yeltsin that it wasn't a threat and that they could get away with NATO expansion and not ruin relations with the Russians. That was their view. At least they faced up to the fact that NATO expansion had a real downside and that downside had to be dealt with. And they, of course, went to great lengths to assuage Yeltsin to make NATO expansion work. But after Clinton left office, and then you get into the 2000s, we begin to adopt this view that we can do pretty much anything we want, and the Russians shouldn't view it as a threat. We're a benign hegemon, and how could anybody think otherwise? And again, this just violates strategy 101. It just makes no sense at all. And I don't understand how sophisticated people, and we're supposed to have leaders, who are sophisticated, or at least somewhat sophisticated in the foreign policy realm or the national security realm. But that does not appear to be the case. And I would argue, Danny, that's why we're in so much trouble today.
I couldn't agree with you more. I want to see how some of these same concepts we're talking here in the Russia-Ukraine war are now about to apply. Hopefully not, but potentially in this Venezuela situation that's brewing down in the Caribbean Sea. But before I get there, there's one more thing I want to do here in the Ukrainian European style, and that is to show a soundbite that actually Gary dug up this morning that shows that 1 month into this war, there was a certain figure in Ukraine that actually correctly foresaw what the Europeans would do to try to drag this war out, no matter how many Ukrainians it cost, in order to harm Russia. You might be surprised by who it is.
Я думаю, що у всіх різні інтереси. Причому у всіх у Заходу є ті, хто хоче, щоб ця війна йшла довго. Тому що це буде виснаження Росії, але ціною України, ціною життя людей. Це точно вигідно деяким країнам.
So, 1 month into the war, President Volodymyr Zelensky acknowledged on camera that he knew there were those in the West that wanted to drag the war out to harm Russia, no matter how many Ukrainians it cost in the process. And yet, and that was just days before the end of the Istanbul meetings. At the time that video was made, he was seriously thinking about taking the deal at Istanbul and bringing the war to an end. And yet, he chose rather poorly against his own people. Why do you suppose that is?
You know, you beat me to the punch. When you showed Zelensky talking, I was going to immediately bring up what happened at Istanbul. But of course, you did that, being the smart guy that you are. And
well,
if you think about what happened at Istanbul, right, the Russians reached out to the Ukrainians almost immediately after the war started and said, let's negotiate a deal. Because the Russians just wanted to create a situation where Ukraine would not enter NATO. The Ukrainians, and of course this means Zelensky because he was in charge, agreed to negotiate. And you had the famous Istanbul negotiations. And at that point in time, Zelensky was willing to cut a deal to end the war. And both sides were therefore making excellent progress towards some sort of agreement. Now, we don't know whether they would have ultimately succeeded had they pursued that course of action. We don't know. But they were heading down that road. And this is evidence that Zelensky understood that it would be a good thing to get the war over with. But of course, Zelensky changes his mind. And why does he change his mind? He changes his mind because the Americans and the British, the Anglo-Saxons, come in, mainly in the form of Boris Johnson, and tell him to walk away from the negotiations. This was a fatal mistake on his part. Now, the question is, why did he do it? He did it because the Americans and the British believed that we could defeat the Russians. We could bleed the Russians white. They did not foresee a long war where Russia would emerge victorious. They thought that given Ukrainian successes on the battlefield and given the power of economic sanctions, we could bring the Russians to their knees. And Zelensky bought the argument. And once he bought the argument, he was committed to a long war. And that's where he is today. It's almost impossible for Zelensky at this point to do a 180-degree turn. They have to get new leadership in Ukraine, and they have to move in a completely different direction for their own good. But Zelensky can't do that. He made the fatal mistake at the end of the Istanbul negotiations in early April 2022 of going along with the Americans and the British.